There are an estimated 25 million autistic people in the world. When I was growing up, the only option for me was mainstream education. But now, here in America, a systematic approach to eradicating autistic traits is being rolled out in specialist schools across the country. Applied Behavioural Analysis, ABA, is now taught in hundreds of specialist schools all over the United States. And I've come to one of the biggest ones. It's an hour outside of Boston.
Allie's turn. I'm going to say moo, me, moo. Ryan's turn. Say one more time.
Many of the children here have a far more severe form of autism than I have.
Doing it.
Not only do they struggle with social interactions, but many of them are non-verbal.
Me, moo, me. Ryan's turn. Moo. Nice job. Learned another bubble.
Although this technique has obviously moved on from its early days in the 1960s, it still follows a system of rigorous repetition. The idea is that by doing the same tasks over and over again, autistic behaviour can be stamped out, making the child more socially normal.
You're not doing it! Never!
Really uncomfortable. It's just a mass of noise and colour. It's not symmetrical. The stripes all around the walls. The windows aren't in line. You know, everything else is pretty chaos. But it's pretty intense. I think it's going to be a pretty intense day. For me, there's some sort of fundamental questions to be asked about the purpose of this sort of education. ABA has been largely rejected in the UK on the grounds that it's trying to force autistic children to be something they're not.
So I want to talk about, like I said, the denial of neurodivergent identity and culture. And I think this starts very, very young. For those of us who are identified autistic or ADHD, PDA, whatever our neurodivergent identity is, something that I know that happens a lot because I've been in the education system as a teacher, as an educator, and I'm a parent of autistic children, and I'm an autistic person myself. Our children are identified or diagnosed neurodivergent. And then, you know, we're given all this information around what that means. What does it mean to be autistic? So let's use autism as an example. Our child is diagnosed autistic or identified autistic. We're told, you know, what that might mean for them, and everybody's going to be different. So we all have different autistic expressions or neurodivergent expressions. So let's say, for example, a child is identified autistic and they have met the criteria against the triad of impairments. Ugh, yucky language. So we know that they're having struggles, maybe in the school system, because their communication is different, because they need to move their bodies to be able to pay attention. They need to be out of their seat and away from their desk intermittently to get that sensory input, to regulate. They need to stim. They might need to rock. They might need to have sensory tools. They might need to not make eye contact so that they can listen. They might need to doodle or draw like I do, like I am now, in order to be able to concentrate. And what happens is, instead, we're given all this information about what it means when our children are identified or diagnosed, and then we go on with the rest of our lives being encouraged to pretend that that never happened, that our children weren't identified as neurodivergent. And people might hear that and go, what? No, we're not. But let me count the ways in which we are. When you have an autistic child in the education system and they are being sent home reports or IEPs, or families are receiving phone calls or emails because the child won't sit still in the classroom or won't make eye contact or will only eat certain foods or has sensory processing differences, and that's sold to families as problematic or deficits, then we are pretending a child is not autistic. When there is an expectation for a child, and I'm specifically speaking about children, but I will speak about adulthood in a moment. When we are speaking about autistic children not fitting in or adapting or complying in a classroom or a social environment, then we are denying their identity and culture. We are pretending that they are not autistic if we expect them to be behaving as though they are neuronormative.
Which creates complex PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress injury. It's not a disorder, it's an injury. Because your humanity is being devalued. You feel diminished, defeated, worthless, as less than. And then this creates shame or guilt or both. Because according to this neuronormative system, you are dysfunctional. And these violent outbursts, which you can witness occasionally in an autistic meltdown, is nothing else than the fight response. It is a survival response to a perceived threat. Or, in the worst case, dissociative states under stress, which is the freeze response. It's another survival response to threat, when fight or flight are not possible. The classic image in the animal kingdom is the possum playing dead, but it's not playing. It's just in the freeze state, so it appears unattractive to the predator. In the animal kingdom, usually predators are programmed to not eat dead animals. It's their instinct, so they walk away. And the prey might survive.
Now, when we think about the fawn response, it really is an adaptation to a threat and an attempt to, as Pete Walker says, to purchase safety by using servitude. And what I really mean by that is that if we're talking about disorganized attachment, for example, where the heart of that part of attachment is that the source of safety, the parent, the caregiver, is also the source of fear, alongside a more anxious type of attachment where we have a lack of consistency and a significant lack of predictability, alongside over-involvement in the parent's state of mind, which also occurs in disorganized attachment. And so when we're talking about the heart of this, what I want to get to is that the fawn response is really an attempt to please, to purchase safety at the expense of your own. Because a parent is in some sort of threat position. They are in fight or flight, they are critical, they are unsafe emotionally in some way, and fighting back is not an option. And so we develop the fawn response to sort of trying to get in front of it, as I talk about a lot, to rotating around their mood and mind, going back to what I just said about anxious styles and disorganized styles of being over-involved. Basically, we are overly involved, and we had to be, because our parents' mood and mind, as all parents do, but it really does in these styles, determine the temperature in the home. And we learn that we can get our needs met by paying an excessive amount of attention to making sure the parent is okay. As I talked about earlier in the week, I guess last week, enmeshment and parentification, these are really about melding into the parent's world to get your needs met. And so that really is what happens, is that this fawn response develops, and we take this into our adult lives, and it becomes the way we deal with all relationships, right? We have this attachment pattern, and then we have that we've been responding to in childhood, and then we have our parents, their body, their mood, their mind as it played out in their own nervous system. And so what we're really talking about here is a way to kind of get our nervous system regulated to calm and soothe the temperature inside of us when the parent's elevating, or when they're being neglectful or shutting us out or collapsing or being wounding. We're trying to manage our own bodies. And the fastest way to do that for many of us, the safest way, the quickest way, the most guaranteed way, was to fawn, was to please and appease that parent or parents or the environment. And so we take this and it becomes the template for our adult lives. So what else does fawning look like? It can look like, as you grow up, an inability to say no, to set boundaries, to even know what your own needs are, because you have compulsively learned that it needs to always be about everyone else first before you can be okay. And when you make it about them, you're calming your own system and you're numbing your own pain, right? If I'm focused on you, then I don't have to pay attention to all of the emptiness, the wounds, the longings, the fears, the hypervigilance in my own body, because I'm trying to regulate that by compulsively caretaking you. It can certainly look like over-apologizing, never saying no, never really having an opinion that seems anywhere near controversial, trying to sort of always be there for others and rescue them. I would say a large majority of those in the helping professions probably have had to have a fawning response. And I would say a high tolerance. One of the things about therapists is that we are able to sit with you and listen to your story and your pain, because most of us already know some form of pain. And we were trained to do that in some way also with a parent. And that can be actually a super skill, I believe, if you're good about working on your own boundaries and getting support, to be able to sit with someone in their darkest, most difficult moments in life, or just their deepest reflections on their goals, their childhood. That to me is beautiful. It does come at a cost, but I also think that in many regards, it's a beautiful skill to have. If it's your job, of course, but if you spend your whole life doing that and it's not your job, you're often sacrificing yourself in the process. And so we might, change our preferences, our needs. We might minimize our own physical pain. And I would argue that many of us have chronic illnesses because we have stuffed and repressed all of the feelings we have in the sake and service of the other, of the parent, and then of the partner, of the children. These are often the kind of parents who will, and there's varying degrees of this, but sacrifice everything for their children, for their partners, and oftentimes it will take a life-threatening illness or something significant to really shine the light on how little attention we have paid to ourselves.
I hate the word compliance too. I hate the word resilience. It's like, we wouldn't take, not that I want to compare myself to an animal. Well, I don't mind being compared to an animal because I love animals. We don't take dogs and expect them to be cats or behave like cats and live as cats. And then when they do, we call them resilient. We just don't have that expectation, right? They're all animals, but they're different kinds of animals. Human beings. We're being sold this deficit-based pathology that being neurodivergent means that we're less than, or that we're not quite as, insert whatever word fits, as people who are not neurodivergent. We are a different kind of person. And then the other issue is that where people are claiming to support autistic children, it's against a generic framework. Like professional development for me as an educator was always the same. It was always the same when it came to autistic children. And it was about having a timer, having a routine on the wall, having notes on the board. And there's nothing wrong with those things, but there's a complete dismissal of individualised support when we're coming at it from a generic framework. Not every autistic child is the same. First and foremost, we are individuals. Autism is a word that describes what kind of person we are. And when we take autistic people and we put them in an environment and ask them to not be autistic, then we are denying their right to their identity and culture. And this happens so often because what has been sold to us as a society is that autism is a medical disorder. Anything that is outside of neuronormative has been sold to us as a disorder, a medical disorder, rather than an identity and a culture. And if we could see it in a different way, our supports look very different. Yes, humans are animals. I'm going through this right now, RE school. It's feeling impossible to get teachers to comprehend difference. It's amazing how challenging this is. It is the individual supports missing versus a blanket system. Yeah. My daughter presents with PDA, so personal needs being supported has to change daily. Denying our rights to functional brains, serious, way more issues communicating, living their way. When we don't allow a child to move their bodies, we don't allow them to regulate if they're neurodivergent. When we don't allow children to have their sensory tools, and they are tools, we are disabling them. Because the disability isn't that we are inherently flawed, it's that we possess a different neurobiology. And so when our environment is not supporting and accepting and nurturing of our neurobiology, we are disabled. So when we are put into an environment and expected to be someone we're not, something we're not, when we're expected to behave in ways that from a neurobiological perspective we're really not capable of long term, that is disabling. And then we come into adulthood as neurodivergent people with co-occurring conditions.
Autistic people. Now, infantilization is a type of discrimination that many disabled people face. It's when someone who isn't a child is treated as if they are a child. They aren't respected as full adults. They maybe are seen as less intelligent. Apparently, a third of people in Britain think autism itself is an intellectual disability, and autism in particular does suffer from this sort of image of being a children's disorder.
To say I am autistic really embodies my autistic expression. It means that autism is central to my being. It has influence over everything that is me. It influences my thinking, my feeling, my processing, my ideas, my beliefs. My autism influences the food that I choose, the clothes that I wear. It influences the way I sleep. It literally influences every part of who I am and how I live out my life. But identity is really important because for 33 years, I thought that there was something wrong with me. I thought that I was a broken version of a non-autistic person or a second-rate non-autistic person. And I spent my life seeking answers as to why I was so different. I was very good at pretending that I was just like everybody else. I was popular. I was great at socializing on the outside. However, I was an unidentified autistic person, and I internalized my struggles. I internalized my disability. So underneath all of that seeking and searching was somebody who really didn't want to be here, and somebody who didn't know who they were. And can you imagine the internal battle, the struggle between these two worlds that collide? My autistic nature, that is problem seeking and problem solving, on this 33-year journey of wanting to know who I am, wanting to come to terms with my identity. What is my identity? And this other part of me that didn't want there to be anything wrong with me. So I was spending all this time trying to be like everybody else, which is what we call masking in the autistic community. So these two were, clashing all of the time. When I was 33, I was finally diagnosed autistic, and literally every single question I ever had about myself was answered. Every single question. And I'd spent 33 years trying different faiths and denominations and seeing psychiatrists and psychologists and GPs and reading self-help books and doing group sessions on just about everything you could think of, and seeing psychics and clairvoyants, and 33 years, that's a long time. So identity is everything, because that's what took me from thinking there was something wrong with me to understanding who I am.
Qualities around autistic traits in women, especially around needing to be alone or seeking refuge in being alone. And I wanted to understand and share more about why I think that happens. So I found an article based on a paper from someone who is a PhD, I believe, still a PhD candidate in England. And the paper is titled Reacting, Retreating, and I'll link it down below, Regulating and Reconnecting, a summary of findings from Florence Neville from February 2022. So it was basically looking at understanding, and I think there were like 16 people that were surveyed that were autistic, trying to understand why alone time was important for them. And so let's just go through the terms and define that alone time in this paper means three things. Number one, you are by yourself and you will not be interrupted by others. Number two, you are in a space that you feel comfortable in. And number three, you are able to choose what you do in this time and space. And this is what Florence found. Number one, that part of being alone is in response or reacting to social and sensory overwhelm. And this is really important because I think that no matter how you identify on the spectrum, most people have a need for some alone time in some way. And what we really want to do here is start to prioritize it, value it, and stop shaming it, and find ways to create it. So the participants were often overwhelmed by social and sensory input and needing to mask. Remember that masking is really about having to be mindful of really the face, the literal face, the world, the energy you're presenting to the world while you're managing a brain that doesn't necessarily want to engage in the social world or rules that way, right? So you're being mindful of managing the input of sensory stuff. You're being mindful of how you're expressing yourself. So the definitions are this, that social input, managing social input, could be verbal or non-verbal communication. And it says that it wasn't always a problem, but difficult or intense or long periods of being in a social space is often physically and emotionally distressing. The second one is sensory input. This is including things like distracting sounds, bright lights, and uncomfortable temperatures. Some sensory input was distracting or even painful. And in social spaces, as I was mentioning in the last video I made, it's really hard to control the input. You cannot control if you're at some event and it smells bad, or you're in an office and now someone's microwaving their food. This was a huge issue for me, and before things changed a few years ago, that I had an office that had an ocean view, but it was near the bathroom and there was a microwave in that area. And I would have my door closed, and every day I would smell things that made me so angry and dysregulated. And then trying to manage that while seeing patients was actually really difficult. And even when I changed to a different office down the hall, I could still, my sense of smell is the greatest curse, and very common of those who have autism or on the spectrum, that it's like rage inducing, much like misophonia is, which is the sound for like people's mouth sounds and chewing. It literally is a rage response. Okay, so sensory input, difficult to control. And then masking means behaving in ways that made non-autistic people feel more comfortable. It included performing, being engaged or switched on, like I'm listening, performing different social roles or personas. Oh, now I'm being the psychologist versus, the mom in the classroom. Making small talk, hate that one, and stopping themselves from stimming. So it says that trying to do all of that often made the participants feel exhausted and overwhelmed, even if it was someone they loved. And I've said this, that there are times when even with my own kids, and someone asked me, how did you raise 4 kids with all that sensory trigger stuff going on? I honestly don't know. But now it explains a lot of why I'd be sitting there and trying to hold on to just listen, just pay attention, just get them to bed. But really feeling like, oh my God, I'm going to freak out if this goes on much longer, but not wanting to show that, especially because I had an unsafe parent who had a lot of rage and anger issues and irritability. So trying to hold all that in, I can really see why I would isolate so much in the very small amount of time if they were ever gone. I really would almost always choose being alone. So there can be a lot of discomfort, pain, confusion, difficulty happening. The second reason why people with autism often like to be alone is to retreat from social and sensory distractions. And so this research says it was very important for them to have safe spaces to retreat to, away from social input, everyone coming at you or needing to mask, and negative sensory input. Safe spaces help recovery also from overwhelm. So locking the door, getting into a quiet space, and the safe spaces could include clear, minimalist spaces, spaces where the temperature, lights, and sounds and smells were controllable, cozy, comfy spaces, interesting spaces, or spaces where there are preferred activities like a puzzle to be done or maybe art, things like that. And then there were also safe spaces outdoors. And so these outdoor spaces provided happiness, safety, and inspiration. Natural spaces away from other people were often places where people feel less inhibited. places with sensory input that felt good, and spaces to think clearly.